Welcome to the Champions of Active Women podcast. In this podcast, we will interview individuals who have been successful within athletics and beyond. We hope that these interviews will encourage and inspire girls and women to be active for a lifetime, to reach their goals, and to break new barriers in sport and life. This podcast is brought to you by the Active Women's Health Initiative and the Sports Medicine Research Institute at the University of Kentucky. The mission of the Active Women's Health Initiative is to optimize health and promote physical activity and wellness for girls and women across the lifespan. We hope you enjoy our conversations and join us in understanding women's health today to ensure women's health tomorrow.
Welcome to the Champions of Active Women podcast. I'm your host for the day, Natalie Jones, and this podcast is brought to you by the Active Women's Health Initiative within the Sports Medicine Research Institute at the University of Kentucky. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing Jennifer Gottschalk. She grew up as a multi-sport athlete participating in dance, soccer, cross country, and swimming. She went on to be a collegiate swimmer and team captain at Washington State University while pursuing a political science pre-law degree. Between undergrad and law school, she briefly competed in draft legal sprint triathlons. While in law school, Jen pursued a career in sports working at the San Jose Sharks NHL team and the Pac12 Conference and Networks. Since law school, she found her way back to the sport of triathlon, both professionally and personally. Jen currently works as an attorney with the IRONMAN Group and had a busy year in 2019, competing in 4 of their races, including the IRONMAN 70.3 World Championship in Nice, France, and IRONMAN Florida, where she became an Ironman finisher. Jennifer, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so we are over Zoom, so people know, in our own homes during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm excited to sit and talk with you virtually, and I know our listeners are excited to hear all about your experience. So can you just kind of talk briefly about how you got into sport?
Yeah, sure. So my main sport growing up was swimming, and I originally got into that by my parents just wanting us to be water safe growing up in California. But they really encouraged us to do anything, which is why I did dance and soccer. In middle school, I found cross country and continued that all the way through high school. But swimming was always really my first love. And I ultimately knew that everything else would stop for that because that's where my real goals were. But given my background, triathlon became kind of the natural next step post-college and post-law school.
Yeah, so can you talk about being a collegiate athlete and kind of how that impacted your education?
Yeah, being a student athlete definitely had a huge impact on my education. I think swimming, as does many sports, but swimming requires so much dedication. You know, we're known for doing 2-a-days all year round and things like that. And so I was really forced to have time management skills, and that played a huge factor in my education and just being the student that I was. I think also that my desire to kind of overachieve translated from sport into school as well, and my competitive nature translated into the classroom. I didn't view it as just, needing to get my homework done or this or that, but really like I wanted to be the best in everything I did. And I think that's from my competitive background. For me, swimming was also a huge motivator. Like my parents never had to ground me or discipline me in the way that like a lot of kids get disciplined. It was, if you don't do this, you can't go to swim practice. And that to me was like the worst thing you could say to me. So I think that played a huge role because of that, I was always on time with assignments and writing essays and getting everything done because I didn't want sport to be taken away.
Yeah, I've always said that it sounds like an oxymoron, but being involved in sports or training for an Ironman helps be more efficient and be able to get things done. And some people are like, but you're so busy, athletics, being a student athlete is hard, but like you said, it definitely can positively influence your performance in sport and in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, like, I grew up with the specific goal to attend a Pac-10 institution. You know, it's the Pac-12 now, but it was Pac-10 for me. And I grew up knowing that those institutions were high achieving in academics as well as athletics. And I knew I wanted to swim. So it was like, you have to have good grades in order to attend one of those schools.
Yeah. And so moving on from, your career as a student athlete and a student in both college and then going into to law school, how do you feel like being an athlete impacted your career choice?
I think it had a huge impact on my career choice. My parents will tell you that I was saying I wanted to be a lawyer from the time I was really young. I remember really making that choice around high school and gearing college towards that. However, I still didn't know exactly what kind of lawyer I wanted to be, but I couldn't escape my love for sports. And so I had this dream to become an attorney my whole life. But the type of attorney I wanted to be was impacted by my life in sports. And when I finished my senior year of swimming at WSU, we had a lot of changes going on, but I ultimately got the opportunity to coach for a year there. And that was really exciting. But as I was finishing that up, I knew I still really want to go to law school, but I can't envision my life leaving this world of sport. And so what does that look like? And that's when I really discovered, the in-house counsel route for sports entities. And from that day forward that I, kind of came across that, was determined to make that something I would do one day.
Yeah, you've primarily worked as a professional with sports organizations. Do you feel like being an athlete has impacted your career in terms of not just working for sports organizations, but your day-to-day career duties?
Yeah, I think so. I know that I think even when I was maybe interning at the Sharks, but especially when I was an intern at the Pac-12 during law school, and then now working as an attorney for IRONMAN, it's like I had knowledge already in like what the Pac-12 conference was and like who their consumers were and like who they were servicing. It's the same with Ironman. Like I am a triathlete and we own a few other brands, including like the Rock and Roll Marathon brand. And I've ran in those races and I've competed now in our Ironman races. And I think I see a direct impact in my work because I'm able to work on a lot more of like our operations agreements and things like that, and work with our event teams on their contracts. And I of course always have some questions, but there's a lot of things that I already inherently know what the event looks like, what takes place there, and it translates into my ability to draft contract language that's applicable.
Yeah. And what can you say about Ironman and female athletes and kind of break down what an Ironman is?
Yeah, so it's called an Ironman, and you're considered an Ironman finisher, if you're man or woman, if you complete one of our races, which is a 2.4-mile swim, 112-mile bike, and 26.2-mile run. And what historically, the very first Ironman triathlon was all men, and it was a small group, and then over the years, women started joining the sport and competing in that distance. And it's still, definitely there's more men than women in the sport. But through our work that we do, we have a program that's called Women for Tri that was created to address the gap in female participation in triathlon versus running. Like running races historically have a lot more female participation, and sometimes even more women than men in the sport. But in triathlon, we're watching it grow, and the Women for Tri program is working. I don't directly work for Women for Tri, but we have a coordinator position at Ironman, and sometimes I've helped with legal issues. But globally, they have seen growth, and particularly in the 70.3 distance, which is half of the full Ironman. But they've seen growth in both, and so they're working on that. And I think more and more women are doing it, which is really awesome.
Yeah, it's a great organization of just empowering women to try triathlons, as well as I think they have a great platform, social media wise, in terms of just women seeing other women participate, is really helpful. And so speaking of physical activity, right, and participation in sport, how do you feel like being an athlete has impacted your current health decisions or your lifestyle choices?
It's had a huge impact. I grew up being so athletic, doing multiple sports, sometimes even on a day-to-day basis, having 3 different practices or whatever it might be. And I'm not going to lie, I lost a little bit of that when I was in law school. But I really viewed that as a time in my life that was like a means to an end, right? The studying was the most intense thing I'd ever done. And my health was being impacted in different ways that maybe didn't let me be as active. But I was eager to find that again from the moment I finished law school or finished taking the bar exams. But I know that my history as being an athlete affects who I am now, and it had everything to do with my ability to get healthy and maybe even be the healthiest I've ever been post law school. And I think that I just, with that background, I've learned, how to be active, but be active in a way that where I'm doing things that I love. I've learned how to eat right for my body over the years because of my activity levels and all of that. And I think it's really so wrapped up in my identity at this point that I'm like the best version of myself when I'm being healthy and active. Then my brain works better and I'm a better lawyer because of it. And I'm a better wife, daughter, sister, friend, all of it. So I think it's had a huge impact.
Yeah, that's awesome. It definitely, just movement, taking care of yourself, that holistic wellness is so important for overall life, like you said. So I'm curious, because you've talked a lot about positives, right, of sport and being an athlete, but have you ever sustained an injury that maybe put a little bump in the road or that you had to work through?
Yeah. So when I was like actually, an athlete, like a student athlete before becoming an adult and all of
Still an
that.
athlete. You're still an
Yeah.
athlete.
I luckily like never had anything major all through high school or anything like that. In college, I started having like nagging pain in my wrists. And I ultimately did have a wrist surgery going into my senior year of college swimming. I learned that basically, I'm not a doctor, so keep that in mind, but that basically I was born with kind of naturally fused wrists. So my activity that I'd done my whole life, like climbing out of pools, push-ups, all of that had caused me to have some kind of like tears and strains in the ligaments and tendons in my wrist because my weight wasn't being evenly distributed the way a normal person's would on their wrist. So that was my first like real injury. I ended up, recovering from the surgery, running a lot that summer. And I still got best times my senior year and all that. So that was good. But then senior year also ended up with these severe spasms in my traps. And that was tricky. I was in the training room a lot. I was at one point, on an anti-inflammatory, a pain med, muscle relaxant. They were trying to just figure out how to keep me swimming. I only had, a few months left to go. So that was probably my real, my next, main experience with any injury. And then a week before I moved to Florida in 2018, so I was just, really finding my stride and getting healthy again post law school, I sprained my MCL and tore my meniscus in my right knee. And so that was tricky. That was like the first time that it was like an actual injury. Like I did something and now I'm hurt, where the other things just kind of came about from my activity level or what have you. So
Yeah, did that experience impact your future participation, like what you're doing now? Do you still deal with that, or have you learned how to cope with it?
yeah, well, first of all, I think it might have played a factor in me coming back to triathlon. I was moving down here to work for Ironman, so I think it might have happened anyway. But when I moved here, it was 1 week after that, and I had no choice but to just like, swimming was the only thing I could do. So it really got me back in the pool for the first time with any consistency in like 4 or 5 years. I luckily moved in with a physical therapist. So I didn't go see someone at an office, but I had my own personal physical therapist that was able to help me every single day. It took me months to be able to bike, to run. I now am dealing with some nagging stuff in my left hip that we think is partially my natural alignment. I have some interesting alignment things, but it also might be a little bit residual from compensating that for a large part of 2018 for that right knee. But there's no way to know for sure, I guess. But yeah, it definitely had an impact, but ultimately I was able to recover. And I did my Ironman last year, so I think it's okay. But I still am trying to be careful with it and pay attention. I try to really listen to my body.
I think that that's something that as we get older and we get more comfortable with sports and athletics and testing ourselves is really knowing our bodies and listening. I found that it's been interesting to see what I used to be able to do or just push through or not realize. And then now realizing recovery, stretching, all of this is so important to sustain activity throughout a lifespan.
Absolutely. And I think that that's something that when you've been a collegiate athlete, as I know you have as well, is a really interesting thing to navigate as an adult. Like, I just listed out everything I did in order to just finish out my senior year while dealing with these severe trap spasms. I couldn't lift my arms over my shoulder, my arms above my shoulders, right? And I had to swim. And it's like, knowing that now, it's like nobody cares if I do an Ironman this year other than me, right? I'm not doing it for anyone other than myself ultimately. And so you need to listen to your body. You don't need to be on pain meds and muscle relaxers and all that to get through something. And so, but I think that, the collegiate athlete and past athlete in us sometimes wants to push through at times where for general life is probably not, the most appropriate times to push through. So trying to listen.
There's definitely a little interesting mental game going on of how to push, when to listen. But yeah, it's so true. Going from being an athlete or a collegiate athlete to then being just a human athlete is a transition for sure. And so I'm curious, it's a big daunting question, but how would your life be different if you never had the chance to play sport?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And, I've listened to a lot of the other podcasts you've done, and it's a hard one for, it seems like, everyone to answer. So I was trying to really think, like, just imagine it, even if it's not realistic. I ultimately have no idea, but I think I mentioned earlier how my parents were saying I want to be a lawyer from the time I was really young. So I think about things like that, like, oh, maybe I would still be a lawyer, but maybe I'd be a different kind of lawyer. But I don't know. I'm like, without all of that, would I have had the drive once I was 21 and graduating college to continue in education? I don't know. Where did that come from? Was it in me since the beginning, or was it because I'm an athlete and developed kind of that headspace and that competitive desire? I don't know. But
yeah, it's hard to know what fosters what, Is it your push, your competitiveness edge, or did sport help make that happen? Yeah, it's a hard question. And so I want to leave you with another hard question, is what advice would you give to girls or women about being active, maybe even if they wanted to try triathlon? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I would say just do whatever makes you happy and whatever brings you joy. My club coach growing up always said joy elevates performance, but I think it applies even if you're not trying to be active in a competitive atmosphere. It just, being active will make you happy, especially if you're doing something you love. And I would say listen to your body, not only to help, determine what activities you want to do, but also to help you determine when it's appropriate to rest and recover and take a step away from certain activities or sports. And that I think it's okay if you do have to take a break at some point in life, but I think finding your way back to an active lifestyle and a healthy lifestyle is really important. And for triathlon, I would say, I mean, anyone can do it, truly. I know it's the Ironman motto, but anything is possible. And a lot of people think that there's, barriers to the sport, and maybe if you don't have a swimming background or something like that. But I would say for all the non-swimmers out there who think that it might be interesting, swimming is so small proportionally in the sport of triathlon, so you can do it.
I think that's a great way to end with the Ironman mantra of anything is possible. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Champions of Active Women podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the Active Women's Health Initiative and was produced by the Faculty Media Depot at the University of Kentucky. If you enjoyed this episode, you can listen and subscribe to all of our episodes wherever you find your podcasts. For up-to-date information about the Active Women's Health Initiative, you can find us on social media at UKAWHI. Thank you for supporting us as we work to promote health and physical activity among girls and women across the lifespan.